In the darkest, most unregulated corners of the internet, users engage in a strange, digital folklore. They trace faces, they take photographs of human expressions, and reduce them to crude, black and white line art. They call these caricatures Soyjaks, using them to mock, to project, and to communicate in a bizarre, layered language of irony. Most of these drawings are harmless, based on random strangers or minor internet personalities. But one drawing, a stark, unsettling trace of a wide manic grimace with blank, staring eyes, was not a joke. The community gave it many names, attaching twisted fictional lore to its pixelated grin. But the chilling truth buried beneath layers of digital anonymity and internet irony is that the face belonged to a real man. The drawing was a trace of a monster, a man named Jerry Oberman, nicknamed Rapeson. This is not a meme. This is the documented, terrifying history of a phantom who walked out of the American wilderness and into the digital age. The story begins in the isolated mountain town of Delta, Colorado. Born on April 21st, 1967, Jerry Oberman was the only child of Larry and Eva. The landscape of Delta is vast and unforgiving, a place where secrets can easily be swallowed by the pines and the thin mountain air. But the true horror of Jerry's early life did not come from the environment. It came from inside his own home. He was the victim of relentless psychological torture at the hands of his older cousins. They called it pranks, but the reality was a systematic dismantling of a child's mind. They would ambush him in the dead of night, pinning the young boy down beneath heavy, suffocating bed sheets in pitch darkness. They would beat him, chanting bizarre, degrading phrases over and over, breaking his spirit piece by piece. The muffled, desperate screams of the young boy were recorded on cassette tapes. Hours and hours of terror, captured on magnetic tape, played back as a cruel trophy. It was a crucible of abuse that forged something inhuman. The final fracture occurred in the spring of 1985. Jerry was in high school, a quiet, disturbed teenager clinging to the one bright spot in his life, his high school sweetheart. When she left him for another boy, the fragile architecture of his sanity collapsed entirely. His father later recounted the events of that week with a hollow, haunted voice. Jerry locked himself in his childhood bedroom. He refused to eat. He refused to speak. He sat in the dark playing the bleak, repetitive industrial drone of the experimental band Swans on an endless loop. Day after day he withdrew until the household carried the heavy, unmistakable metallic scent of copper, the scent of his own blood. When they finally broke the door down, they found him surrounded by the horrific results of his self-inflicted wounds. He was committed to the state psychiatric asylum for 2 months, missing his high school graduation, missing the final transition into normal adulthood. When he was released in July, he was a hollow shell, showing no interest in society, education, or rehabilitation. His exhausted and terrified parents made a fatal decision. They kicked him out of the house. They unlocked the cage and let the beast wander into the wild. Following his eviction, Jerry Oberman vanished into the frigid, sprawling, unforgiving forests of Colorado. For 3 long years, he lived as a feral ghost off the grid. During this dark period, the local missing persons reports spiked. Hikers vanished without a trace. Campsites were found shredded, abandoned in the dead of night. The official body count from the forest years is listed at 37, alongside dozens of mutilated wild animals. But it wasn't just the disappearances that birthed the legend. It was the terrifying accounts of those who claimed to have seen him in the trees. Witnesses described a towering figure, standing 6'3", covered in mud and blood. But more disturbingly, survivors claimed that when a predatory frenzy overtook him, his very anatomy seemed to distort. Eyewitnesses swore that his spine would stretch, his limbs elongating with the sickening sound of cracking bone, temporarily growing to 7, maybe 8 feet tall in the pale moonlight, before shrinking back to his normal dimensions. Law enforcement dismissed these reports as the panicked hallucinations of traumatized hikers. But the footprints found in the mud told a different story. The strides were simply too far apart for any normal human being. In 1988, his reign of terror in the wilderness came to a brief halt. He was detained at a routine highway checkpoint, a hulking, silent drifter with no identification. Believing him to be a dangerous vagrant, authorities placed him back into psychiatric confinement for a full evaluation. But the facility severely underestimated the cunning of the man they held. Before his trial could even begin, before the true extent of his crimes in the woods could be uncovered, he managed a quiet, completely undetected escape. He vanished once more into the vast, dark American landscape. For the next 16 years, he moved like a shadow, a virus spreading through the country. From the cold streets of Denver down through the dusty expanses of New Mexico, and finally settling in the sweltering, oppressive heat of Texas. He left no physical evidence, only a trail of broken lives and unsolved cases. But by 2004, the Phantom finally ran out of steam. On the desolate outskirts of Austin, Texas, 2 teenagers were exploring the dark, labyrinthine concrete drainage systems beneath the city. Deep in the subterranean gloom, they found him. He was lying face down in the toxic sludge, entirely unresponsive. He had suffered a massive, near-fatal overdose of black tar heroin. When paramedics hauled his 253-pound frame out of the muck, his face was locked in a horrific, permanent grimace. The face that would later be traced and immortalized in the darkest corners of the web. The Austin Police Department detention report remains heavily redacted, but leaked segments paint a portrait of unprecedented apocalyptic horror. The charges filed against Gerald Oberman read like the casualty list of a war zone. 27 counts of arson, 85 counts of aggravated assault, over 400 counts of murder, 33 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 67 counts of abuse of a corpse. When he awoke in the interrogation room, shivering from the cold concrete, he didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny a single charge. He simply stared at the detectives through the two-way glass, smiled with that wide, unblinking grimace, and whispered that he had absolutely no regrets. He told them he would do it all again. He was sentenced to multiple lifetimes, but the state psychiatric board intervened. A rigorous evaluation deemed him permanently, incurably unfit for standard execution. His mind was categorized as broken beyond the parameters of human justice, and so he was transferred to the highest security ward of the state asylum. They thought burying him in a concrete box, wrapped in a straitjacket and pumped full of sedatives, would be the end of Jerry Oberman. They were catastrophically wrong. It was only the beginning of the massacre. The facility was designed to hold the absolute worst of humanity, but Oberman was something else entirely. The internal incident logs from 2005 to 2006 read like a countdown to hell. On April 5th, 2005, he viciously beat his cellmate into critical condition, leaving the man permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Oberman was thrown into solitary confinement for nearly a year, but isolation only fueled his madness. On March 9th, 2006, the guards heard a deafening crash from his cell. Oberman had shattered the heavy porcelain toilet using only his bare heels. By the time the response team breached the steel door, he was sitting in a pool of his own blood, trying to saw his own throat open with a massive 6-inch jagged shard of porcelain. He wasn't screaming in pain. He was laughing. When the medical team treated him, they noted his heart rate never elevated past 80 beats a minute. On July 3rd, he managed to pick the locks of his restraints and breach the facility kitchen. When guards finally found him, 3 hours later, he had locked himself inside the industrial meat freezer. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. He had stripped off his uniform and was simply sitting in the frost, completely unfazed by the lethal cold, waiting. The horror escalated on August 19th. During a routine sweep of his cell, guards cut open his mattress to search for contraband. Deep inside the yellowing foam, they found a severed human tongue. Forensic DNA testing came back entirely inconclusive. It didn't match any inmate in the prison database. It didn't match any missing person. How he acquired it and how long he had been hiding it remains one of the asylum's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. The tension finally snapped on October 28th, 2006. Through a series of manipulated guard schedules and hoarded contraband, Oberman became the primary catalyst for the deadliest, most violent prison riot in the state's history. For 5 hours, the asylum was plunged into complete darkness and absolute anarchy. Fires raged through the cell blocks, turning the facility into an inferno. The official death toll lists 22 guards and over 100 inmates slaughtered in the chaos. It caused mass media outrage. When the National Guard finally breached the walls and retook the facility, they found Oberman sitting calmly in the center of the recreation yard, entirely untouched, surrounded by the horrific aftermath of his masterpiece. Following the massacre, he was placed in permanent, absolute solitary confinement, awaiting a heavily delayed execution date. The physical world locked him away, but the digital world had just discovered him. Internet conspiracy theorists and true crime obsessives began to dig. The legend of the grinning killer bled onto Imageboards. They traced his mugshot. They turned him into a symbol of ultimate, unstoppable malice. Some schizophrenic corners of the web even claimed he was connected to global terror networks, analyzing restored black box flight recordings, claiming to hear his spine-tingling voice screaming a manifesto into the microphone before catastrophic crashes. The myth grew larger than the man, but then the myth began to bleed back into reality. In 2018, users on a banned, deeply illegal subreddit dedicated to archiving horrific media began tracking a user posting under a numerical alias. The user uploaded photographs of a claustrophobic room, a den plastered floor to ceiling in depraved imagery, stacked with high-caliber rifles and barrels filled with decaying organic matter. But the amateur sleuths noticed the background details. On a glowing computer monitor in one of the photos was an open PDF, a sealed court document. the defendant's name, Jerry Oberman. Acting on the digital breadcrumbs, a heavily armed SWAT team raided a flat in Tucson, Arizona. They breached the garage, overwhelmed by the stench of fermenting chemicals and rotting meat. Inside, they found 7 terabytes of unspeakable digital horror. But the apartment was empty. There was a massive hole smashed straight through the drywall, leading out into the dark alleyway. Whatever had been living in that room, whatever had been watching the internet watch him, it knew they were coming. The asylum vehemently denies that Jerry Oberman ever escaped. They release official statements claiming he remains locked in his concrete hole to this day, heavily medicated, rotting away from the sun. They claim the Tucson apartment was the work of a deranged copycat. But the sightings refused to stop. In February of 2026, a brutal, unspeakable assault occurred in a desolate gas station bathroom on a lonely stretch of Midwestern highway. The characteristics of the crime, the sheer, overwhelming violence, the monstrous strength required, and the total lack of forensic evidence left behind, bore the unmistakable, terrifying signature of the Phantom. And then, just months ago, the digital footprint returned. On August 9th, 2025, a nameless profile appeared on a popular video sharing app. The profile picture was an unseen, deeply unsettling, high-resolution photograph of a man with a wide, blank grimace. The account bypassed every security filter on the platform, rapidly posting fragmented, terrifying media, surveillance footage of sleeping families, unintelligible audio loops of a man whispering in a freezing room. Before the panic-stricken server administrators could pull the plug, the videos had been viewed tens of thousands of times. Some say he was finally caught again in Topeka, Kansas, dragged back to the asylum in chains. Others believe the man sitting in that high-security cell is nothing but a decoy, a hollowed-out shell, and that the real Jerry Oberman is out there right now. They believe he is on navigating the dark web, staring back through the compromised webcams of our laptops, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the digital ether and into our homes. He is the boogeyman of the broadband age, a true breathing monster wrapped in the camouflage of an internet joke, an Imageboard drawing made of real blood and bone. So the next time you find yourself scrolling through the dark corners of the web at 3 in the morning, and you see a face that seems just a little too distorted, a little too twisted to be real, do not stare at it for too long. Because while you are looking at the screen, looking at him, you can be absolutely certain that he is looking back.